Welcome to the Fearless Asian Man Show, where we empower Asian men to become strong men who create the relationships and lifestyle they desire. Now, let's get this show started.
We have Will Chou from willyoulaugh.com. And Will, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I would like to dive into your story. As you know, we could just dive into the main meaty points, but I would like to kind of show our audience where you came from. So do you mind giving us a really quick rundown on your story and why you started what you started?
Absolutely. So I'm a Asian American millennial male. And as you can tell, I've had a pretty typical, stereotypical upbringing. So my story in a nutshell is basically that I've had many of the laundry list of struggles that are pretty common with this demographic. And this may include, self-esteem, frustration, resentment, issues with self-love or self-hatred, wealth, friendships, and dealing with the unfairness of life, and so on and so forth. The nice guy syndrome being called that, and so these, as well as many other of those issues that we deal with, really started getting me thinking about how to fix them. And of course, the typical academic school system really never teaches you this stuff. So I went on a journey to find out this information online, and all of a sudden I found myself really getting into scientific research and dissecting and researching the minds of thousands of successful people. And I've been doing that for many years now, just consuming all this advice from so many of the world's successful people, from Will Smith to Warren Buffett to Gary Vaynerchuk, to Bruce Lee, and on, as well as consulting a lot of scientific research. And I've been documenting that on my blog and my own podcast. And so that's really how this has been coming about. I've been kind of sharing my story and trying to help others with what I've discovered to kind of guide them to success.
That's awesome, man. And today, as we were talking earlier, we were thinking the topic of happiness would be really helpful for Asian guys. I think a lot of Asian men can relate with the whole achievement mentality of, going to Harvard or at least the Ivy League and making a lot of money, having a nice car, especially one with a fucking spoiler in the back, or a BMW when you mature. But the whole point is we're chasing happiness, but I think a lot of Asian guys are kind of miserable too, because they're always chasing up this ladder of success, and they're trying to get girls and everything else, but it doesn't ever feel like they're going to be done. And this is a topic that is an awesome topic to cover, and I want to dive into what you've learned and kind of found out. And my first question I have for you is regarding happiness and self-esteem. Why do so many Asian guys suffer from low self-esteem, especially in America?
Yeah, so this is a topic I'm really excited about. I think happiness is something that there's decades of research on, and yet the general public, the mainstream public, they have very flawed perceptions of the topic. They think that, wealth, power, and so forth will bring them this, but once they get there, they're still unhappy. So tying that into self-esteem, the reason that self-esteem is a huge issue as well is because, especially with the Asian culture, their parents, their immigrant parents are imperfect, and they have flawed beliefs about happiness, as do many of us. They're low-income people trying to make it too, so they draw their own conclusions that may be wrong, and so they as well as American, or just I would say capitalistic society as a whole, oftentimes paints this image that you need to be super wealthy to achieve happiness. And when young men and women fail to meet that goal within a certain amount of time, which is oftentimes unrealistic, like, by your early 20s or even early 30s, they get very frustrated and they beat themselves up and they think that they're the problem, that they're the failure. And then when you combine that with all the other Asian issues, that happen, social skill, cultural dynamics that don't relate, and then having lack of male friends and all these other things, you get this huge eruption of low self-esteem. So what I would say to really help Asian men, or just men in general, young men, is really consult some of the big principles that positive psychology has done the research to figure out. One of the big ones being that they've done an international analysis of hundreds of thousands of people across many different incomes and different governments and economies. And what they found is that regardless of where you live, once you reach about 80K annual income, the bang for your buck, the correlation between happiness and wealth dramatically decreases and starts to plateau. And so they controlled and accounted for all these other variables, such as, if it's because, you don't have, it's different if it's a first or third world country, but they found that this principle remains consistent throughout. And so what that means for you is that if once you reach that first world or middle class income, 10xing or 5xing your income to $1 million a year or $10 million a year really isn't going to give you much. You had a rapidly diminishing return. Before that point, yes, there is some increase because, if you don't have food on the table or you can't pay for a doctor bill, that's going to cause you unhappiness. So that's the first big thing. And then really study. I have this article that really breaks down about like 100 different successful people. Study the lives of successful people, and you'll realize that most of them didn't really achieve their success until later in life. Sam Walton didn't start Walmart until his late 40s. Colonel Sanders, his late 60s before he started KFC. And so when you realize this and you look at these successful people, Sheryl Crow or Bruce Lee, who really had to hustle in Hollywood for many years, and still, despite his networking and writing scripts, he still couldn't get into the industry and only found his way in at like towards the last couple years of his life when he found a niche personally training celebrities for martial arts and use that to finally get a role in the field. You realize that it really requires patience, and that is amplified by the problems with social media, which is that you're bombarded with these young people who are rich at a very early age, and you think that's the standard when it's really the exception that's been magnified.
Yeah, just a quick note. I want to let you know that I got some free shit for you guys. If you want to have a guide on how to double your confidence, how to build your backbone and be more assertive, as well as how to meet and date more women and have more of the love life that you want, go ahead and go to the show notes and you'll see a link to the free guide section where you can download all the guides that I just mentioned. Also, another thing I do want to mention to you is join us. Join us in the Brotherhood of Asian Men that I created on Facebook. In this Facebook group, you're going to be meeting as well as supporting and growing with other fellow Asian guys who want to become their most fearless and powerful selves in the areas of their confidence as well as their relationships, whether platonic, but also mainly their love lives. Hope to see you in there. And again, go to the show notes to see a link on how to access that. Back to the show. One trend I've noticed is that a lot of guys are always fucking comparing themselves to other men. And for me, to kind of give a little bit on my story, I used to think self-esteem was based on my achievements. And yes, it is nice when I'm lifting heavy-ass weights in the gym and someone that's like 5-10 inches taller than me is weaker than me. I'm not going to lie, that gave me an ego boost back in the day. It's nice when I can get the hotter girl. It's nice when I have a higher paying job. But I've also lost all of that. Like I've lost strength. I've had other guy friends that are better with women on different nights, blah, blah, blah. And it's a little bit of an emotional roller coaster. So my question to you, Will, is for a guy that is in the self-comparison cycle and is trying to break it, how do you recommend breaking out of it? Because I think for a lot of guys, especially Asian guys, and I've been meaning to do a video on this forever, the reason why they struggle with emotional and happiness issues as well as dating, right? Which is a very emotional process, is because they're thinking about shit too much. And for like an Asian guy, and by the way, I'm describing myself. I'm not trying to say like, hey, you guys suck, I'm better than you guys. It's more like I was always like thinking about ways to improve my life. That was a little bit like an algorithm, right? Like, how do I optimize? How do I optimize? How do I optimize? But it was still in that cycle of self-comparison. And eventually I would get to an intellectual understanding that self-comparison wasn't helping me, but I couldn't turn my fucking brain off in terms of actually not comparing myself. So again, to recap the question, how do you recommend an Asian guy who's very mental and in his head to stop the self-comparison cycle when he's aware of it but can't turn off his brain?
Yeah, so first thing is to realize how important it is to not self-compare or dwell on things. I think the lack of emphasis on this causes people to kind of just, use a mediocre effort to try and solve this problem. And then if it doesn't work, they forget about the issue. But when you look at the research and specifically the book, The How of Happiness by Sonja Lyubomirsky, she really emphasizes the fact that, the two biggest influences towards unhappiness are social comparison and dwelling on things. And so you'll see this all the time. And this will be the first tip I have for you to stop doing this, is to manufacture your environment to make it so that you're not unconsciously and naturally programmed to self-compare. What's the most common way people do this? Well, take a look at neighborhoods. People buy a house in a neighborhood where most or all of the people are richer than them. And then every time they wake up or they walk around or they drive their car, everyone in that neighborhood is better than them. And without them even consciously having to trigger it, they're unconsciously starting to compare and feel bad for themselves. And when you look at Warren Buffett, on the other hand, he lives in a very modest neighborhood. He has the same house he's lived in for like 50 years. And everyone there has modest wages. When you live like that, and I'm not telling you to like live poor, but like if you can live more modestly, you're not put into that environment. And this is just an example. So apply this to your life as well. What's the biggest cause of comparison? It's social media. And, as mentioned, I'm fairly stereotypical. So I struggle with all this too. When I flip on Instagram or YouTube or Snapchat or Instagram stories, what pops up? People showing off where they've traveled to. I love watching, travel videos where, someone my age is like traveling to Indonesia or Thailand, and it looks really cool, but you have to like really set some boundaries with yourself, or you will get caught in that cycle and it'll be hard to stop yourself from dwelling or comparing yourself. So, that's the first thing. Set your environment. Turn off, delete social media, or set it so that you only have 30 minutes a day. And when you're using it, use it productively if possible, to communicate with friends, but not to put yourself into a pity party. The second tip would be really set up a system where your mindset and how you interpret that is better. So use it as inspiration rather than something that causes envy and resentment and negative emotions. Turn it into something positive. This is something that Marie Forleo, a well-known online entrepreneur, talks about. And it's the difference between envy and jealousy. But the basic idea is that you want to turn that into something that actually inspires you to do more. Okay, use that as thinking for yourself so that you think, you know what, that person achieved that, I can do that too. That's really cool that person did that. Realizing that their success does not take away from your success, and that it's not a zero-sum game, and that if anything, their success helps your success because they've done it, now you can too. Or because maybe, when you help them, maybe one day they'll come back to you in some way. Maybe 10 years later, they'll remember your name and they'll remember what you did together. So if you use that energy and multiply that value in a positive rather than negative way, it really does wonders.
Yeah, I totally agree with that point. And the thing I really realized, I used to actually be a very anxious, self-comparative man. just made up self-comparative. I don't actually know if it's a word, but the whole point is I was always measuring up or against another guy. It was always like, okay, is that guy buffer than me? Fuck, I need to work out more. I need to do more cutting, right? Is that guy making more money? I need to work harder at my career and do more development, career coaching. Oh no, is he better at blah, blah, blah? And then it would just become this endless cycle. And I think eventually the one thing I also want to impart on the men listening is the fact that it's not a zero-sum game. Self-comparison is oddly narcissistic in a very subtle way, because it's based on this paradigm of if someone else wins, you lose. And I don't believe that to be true, because the reality is we live in a very abundant universe. And I know that sounds like very woo-woo, like, oh my God, we're going to like abundance and stuff. But the whole point is when other people win, you don't necessarily need to lose. And in fact, that when you learn from people that are more successful in different areas, you actually will win because they will lift you up. And when you're surrounded by people like that, they will lift you up. And what you give is what you get in return. And I found that to be very true. And I think a lot of guys that are operating from a self-comparison standpoint, quite honestly, and I totally get it, by the way, but it's based on this paradigm of there's not enough in the world, and that if someone else wins, then I lose, and that must mean that I suck. And that actually leads to my next point that I want to pick your brain on, is the point of shame. Because I notice a lot of guys that have, Asian American guys, by the way, that have shame issues where they don't feel like they're good enough. They oftentimes will continue to use that paradigm of, I must win against other people. I have to be better than other people. And the question I have for you, Will, is why do Asian guys develop deep shame issues? And tied to that, how do they overcome this deep sense of shame?
Yeah, so when it comes to shame, you're really bombarded on multiple fronts. The obvious one would be your parents. Your parents are have often very narrow frames of what makes a successful person, and if you don't live within that, you get bombarded with disappointment and so forth as an Asian American. And oftentimes their restricted, constrained expectations of what's successful is severely flawed. Just because you're not a doctor or a lawyer or engineer doesn't mean you can't be successful. In fact, it's actually really restraining. Some people could potentially be multi-million-dollar entrepreneurs, but because their parents have prevented them or tried to prevent them, that potential is cut off because they don't even try. So you have the parental front, and then you also have American society's front. So it's not just Asians that deal with this. It's Americans as a whole who have these ideals on what it means to be a man, where you can't cry, or you have to be X level of success, you have to have X level of women, this much money, this much power or status to be successful. And that can really screw with your mind. So kind of tying it back to the insecurity topic, when you have all this wrapped up together and you have these ideas of shame, you have something that's been programmed with the neurons in your brain for many, many years. And so that means that it will take some time to rewire your brain. But the opportunity and the good side to this is that your brain is actually very plastic. It's able to rewire to a certain extent and change your thinking. So by offering yourself positive levels of affirmation and not doing this alone, a good therapist can do wonders, and they have all the research and credibility and skills to really navigate this better than you can yourself. You can really work through that and really improve and come to terms in a mentally healthy way what has been taught to you over the years and wired into your brain.
I hope this episode was helpful for you all. Please subscribe to this podcast, rate it, and share it with a fellow Asian brother. All this content is available on my YouTube channel and website. Links to both are in the show notes. And until next time.